The execution wing was never loud. It didn't need to be. A soft, constant buzz from fluorescent lights hung in the air. A clock ticked somewhere down the long, polished corridor, and boots echoed in a slow, measured rhythm against the concrete floor. Inside cell 42, inmate Daniel Reyes stood perfectly still. His hands were cuffed in front of him, his eyes closed. The schedule was clear. 3 hours. 3 hours until the state would carry out his sentence. But down the hall, a new sound cut through the silence. It was soft, but controlled. A K9 unit. That was unusual for this wing. A powerful German shepherd rounded the corner, muscles tight beneath his dark fur. His handler gave a gentle tug on the leash. "Easy, Ranger." But Ranger stopped, dead still. His ears lifted, his nose flared, testing the stale air. And then he did something he had never done in his 8 years of service. He growled, not at the inmate locked away in the cell. He growled at the guard standing just outside the door. And in that one unexpected moment, something shifted that no one in that prison was prepared for. Daniel Reyes didn't ask for a priest. He didn't ask for a fancy final meal. He didn't even ask to see family. His last request was just one simple sentence: "Bring my K9." The request was denied twice, but on the third try, it was approved. And within minutes of that reunion, a highly trained police dog would signal something that would stop an execution already set in motion. But it wouldn't just delay it. It would expose a truth that had been buried for 10 long years. A truth that lived in scent, in silence, and in a loyalty that simply refused to fade. If you've ever believed that instinct can cut through lies faster than any evidence, then you need to stay with this story. Because this wasn't about a final goodbye. This was about what the dog remembered. 10 years earlier, Daniel Reyes was not a number in a system. He was Officer Reyes of the K9 Division, working in a mid-sized city somewhere in the Midwest. A place with winters that would freeze your breath mid-sentence, and summers that baked the asphalt into shimmering waves of heat. He was paired with a remarkable German shepherd named Ranger. Ranger had a classic black saddle coat, intelligent amber eyes, and a surgical focus that was almost unnerving. He was bred from a European working line, which meant he had a high drive, high intelligence, and perfectly balanced nerves. He was the kind of dog that police departments all over the country competed for. But Ranger didn't bond with just anyone. He bonded with Daniel. From the very first day, their connection was precise and unspoken. Daniel's voice carried a calm authority, and Ranger's body mirrored it. They trained together before dawn, running drills in empty warehouses, working with scent boxes, and doing tracking exercises across muddy fields while the frost still clung to the grass. Before every exercise, Daniel would kneel, press his forehead lightly to Ranger's, and whisper the same 4 words: "Find the truth." It wasn't just a command, it was their ritual. And Ranger always did. He excelled. Within just 2 years, they became the team that supervisors trusted for the most dangerous high-risk warrants and the most desperate missing child recoveries. There was one case that no one forgot. Ranger located a lost toddler 2 miles from home by following a scent trail that had been washed out by heavy rain. Daniel cried that night in the patrol car, with one hand buried deep in Ranger's fur, just whispering, "Good boy," over and over. They were decorated, they were respected, they were a perfect team, until the warehouse raid. The tip came through the narcotics division. An anonymous caller reported a major shipment and armed suspects, all going down at a midnight delivery. Daniel and Ranger were third on the entry team. Body cams were on. Backup was positioned. But from the moment they breached the door, something went terribly wrong. Seconds after they went in, the lights inside the massive warehouse cut out, plunging everything into darkness. There was shouting, the sound of footsteps scattering in every direction, and then gunfire. Short, controlled bursts echoed through the cavernous space. Daniel returned fire toward a shadow he saw moving behind a stack of tall crates. When the lights finally flickered back on, 2 suspects were down. An officer was on the ground, bleeding, and another officer, Sergeant Cole, was clutching his shoulder, claiming Daniel had fired too early, that he'd broken protocol. The investigation that followed moved fast. Too fast. The bodycam footage from Daniel's own unit was suddenly corrupted. A server error, they said. The backup audio was incomplete, full of static. Forensic analysts presented angles that suggested Daniel's shots struck one of the suspects from a trajectory that was inconsistent with his reported position. Sergeant Cole testified that Daniel had advanced beyond his assigned mark, that he had broken formation in the chaos. Daniel insisted he hadn't. He insisted Ranger had been on a strong scent lock near a side exit, and he had followed protocol by covering his dog. But without the footage, without any proof to back up his word, the jury saw negligence. Then, they saw recklessness. And finally, they saw intent. 2 years later, after new evidence mysteriously surfaced that tied Daniel's round to a fatal wound, the charge escalated. Life without parole became a death sentence. All of Daniel's appeals failed. And Ranger? He was reassigned immediately after Daniel's arrest. There was no farewell, no closure. Daniel only asked once, during a short recess in the trial. He turned to his lawyer and quietly asked, "Where's my dog?" No one gave him an answer. Now, 10 years later, Daniel Reyes stood in cell 42. He was 41 years old, with more gray at his temples, but his shoulders were still just as straight. He hadn't spoken much during the final processing. He was quiet, reserved, until the prison chaplain asked him, "Is there anything you'd like to request, son?" Daniel's voice was steady, without a trace of tremor. "Bring my K9!" Warden Huxley almost denied the request outright. Execution protocol was rigid and unbending. Final visits were strictly limited to immediate family, clergy, or legal counsel. Animals were absolutely not permitted inside the execution wing. But when Huxley reviewed the file, he saw that Daniel Reyes had no living parents, no spouse, no children. His entire life was contained in a thin manila folder. But as he scanned the documents, one thing caught his eye. It was an appeal note from 5 years prior, which mentioned Daniel's former K9 service. And tucked deep into the official record, almost overlooked, was a commendation letter from his old police department. It praised Officer Reyes and his K9 partner, Ranger, for exemplary service in locating a missing minor under extreme weather conditions. Warden Huxley read that line twice. It was a small detail, a moment of heroism from a life that was about to be extinguished. He paused, looked at the clock on his wall, and then he made a call. Officer Mark Ellison answered on the third ring. He was Ranger's current handler and had been for the past 8 years. Ranger had adjusted to his new partner, but Ellison knew something that most other people didn't. Ranger never fully transferred his loyalty. There were nights when the dog would just sit near the kennel gate, staring out toward the parking lot long after their shift had ended. It was almost as if he was waiting for someone who was never coming back. When Warden Huxley explained the inmate's last request, Officer Ellison went quiet for a moment. "That inmate, you said his name was Daniel Reyes?" "Yes," the warden confirmed. Ellison took a deep breath. He thought of the old dog, now graying around the muzzle, sleeping in his kennel. He thought of all those nights Ranger spent waiting, and he knew what he had to do. The trip to the prison was tense. Ranger sat calmly in the back of the SUV, his amber eyes watching the scenery fly by. When they arrived, the air in the execution wing felt heavy, thick with unspoken finality. The guards were on edge. As Ellison and Ranger walked down the long corridor, the dog was alert, his head high. And then he stopped. In front of cell 42, his entire body went rigid. He wasn't looking at Daniel, who stood silently behind the bars. Ranger was focused on the guard standing next to the cell. It was a man in his late 40s with a weathered face and a familiar name tag. Cole. It was the same Sergeant Cole who had testified against Daniel all those years ago. Ranger let out a low, deep growl that vibrated through the silent hall. It was a sound Ellison had never heard from him. It wasn't aggression, it was an alert, a warning. The warden gave the order to open the cell. Daniel knelt down, just as he had 1,000 times before. He didn't speak. He just looked into the dog's eyes. Ranger whined softly and nudged his head against Daniel's hand. Then he turned back toward Cole and barked. One sharp, clear bark, and then he moved. And then, he walked over to a specific spot on the floor, right where the wall met the concrete, just a few feet from where Cole was standing. He began to sniff intently, his tail low and stiff. He pawed at the floor, then looked back at Daniel, and then back at the floor. It was his scent alert signal, a signal he was trained to give only when he detected something specific, something hidden. Warden Huxley watched, his face a mask of confusion. Ellison recognized the signal instantly. "He's alerting to something," he said, his voice tight. "There's something there!" Under the warden's orders, the guards pried up a loose floor tile that everyone had ignored for years. Tucked beneath it was a small, waterproof evidence bag. Inside was a tiny memory card, the kind used in body cameras a decade ago. The footage on that card changed everything. It was the corrupted file, and it showed the warehouse raid from Daniel's perspective. It showed him following Ranger, who was locked onto a scent near a side exit. It showed Sergeant Cole moving past them into an unsecured area. And then it showed the most damning part. The flash from Cole's own weapon, fired not at a suspect, but at the other officer who went down. Cole had staged the entire scene, using the chaos and the darkness to cover his tracks, and then framed Daniel to save himself. The scent Ranger had been tracking wasn't a suspect. It was the unique chemical signature of the accelerant Cole used to start a fire and destroy evidence moments before the raid. Ranger had been trying to tell them the truth all along. The execution was stopped just 45 minutes before it was scheduled to happen. The new evidence was undeniable. An emergency investigation was launched, and within a week, Daniel Reyes was exonerated. Sergeant Cole was arrested. The truth, buried for a decade, had finally been found. When Daniel walked out of the prison, a free man, only one figure was waiting for him. It was Ranger. The old dog limped slightly, his muzzle now almost entirely gray, but his eyes were as bright as ever. Daniel knelt down, and for the first time in 10 years, he pressed his forehead to his partner's. "You found the truth, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You found the truth." This incredible story is a powerful reminder that loyalty and instinct can sometimes be the most powerful forms of justice. Thank you for watching, and if you were as moved by this story as we were, make sure to like and subscribe for more. Long pause. He was Ranger's original handler. "I'm aware," another silence. Then Ellison said something unexpected. "Ranger still reacts to that name." The morning of the visit, Ranger was restless. Ellison clipped on the lead. But as they approached the facility gates, his breathing changed. Not fear, focus. Inside the perimeter, Ranger's posture sharpened. His nose moved constantly, processing, cataloging. And then, they turned the final corner towards cell 42. Guard Thomas Miller stood outside. Veteran corrections officer, 15 years inside these walls. He wasn't unkind, but he believed in procedure. "Keep him tight," Miller said. Eyes locked on Miller. A low vibration started deep in his chest, not aggressive, warning. Miller frowned. "He smells something?" Ellison crouched slightly. Ellison felt a flicker of unease. This wasn't stress behavior, this was trained alert posture. But alert to what? There were no narcotics here, no explosives, no open warrants, just concrete, steel, and time running out. "Ranger," he whispered. The name passed through metal like electricity. Ranger's ears snapped back. The growl stopped, replaced with a sharp inhale. Ellison released slight tension on the leash. Ranger moved forward, Daniel dropped to his knees. Chains clinked. Their foreheads touched. 10 years collapsed into one breath. "Good boy," Daniel said softly. Ellison looked away. Miller shifted uncomfortably. But then, Ranger pulled back, not gently. He turned again toward Miller, sat, hard, eyes unblinking. There was a detection bark. "Detect what?" Miller snapped. Ellison didn't answer immediately because Ranger wasn't looking at the floor. He was looking at Miller's waist, specifically at the old leather evidence pouch clipped to his belt. Miller instinctively covered it. "Standard issue," he muttered. No. Explosives? No. Then why is he alerting? Ranger stood, stepped closer, nose inches from the pouch, breathing slow, deliberate. And then he did something that made Ellison's stomach drop. He pawed at it. Inside the cell, Daniel's eyes narrowed. Tension. Ellison spoke evenly. "Sir, with respect, I need to know what he's hitting on." Miller hesitated, then unhooked the pouch, unzipped it halfway. Inside was a small, sealed evidence bag. Old. Yellowed slightly at the edges. Daniel's chest tightened. He recognized that type of seal. Department issue. Case intake. Personal retention from an old case. "Which case?" Miller didn't answer, but Ranger did. He barked again, louder, and this time, he placed himself directly in front of Miller, blocking him from stepping away. The corridor felt smaller, air heavier. Ellison made a decision. "On what grounds?" "Active K9 alert. That's not probable cause in here." Ellison met his eyes. "No, but it's enough for me." Miller slowly handed over the pouch. Ellison removed the sealed bag. He could see the final digits. They matched his case. "How do you have that?" Daniel asked. Miller's voice dropped. "It was surplus intake, logged but never transferred." In urgency. And that was when Ellison realized something critical. Ranger wasn't alerting to the casing itself. He was alerting to the scent on it. Not narcotics, not explosives. Human scent. Familiar human scent. Ellison's mind raced. He could identify a specific individual's scent from a contaminated item. Daniel's eyes were fixed on the bag. "Whose scent?" he whispered. Ranger turned his head slightly and looked straight at Miller. The execution wing was never loud. It didn't need to be. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. A clock ticked somewhere down the corridor. Boots echoed in slow, measured rhythm against polished concrete. Inside cell 42, inmate Daniel Reyes stood very still, hands cuffed, eyes closed. Down the hall, another sound entered the silence. Soft, controlled, a K9 unit. Unusual for this wing. The German Shepherd rounded the corner, muscles tight beneath dark fur. His handler gave a gentle tug. "Easy, Ranger." But Ranger stopped. Dead still. His ears lifted. He growled. Not at the inmate, at the guard standing outside the cell. And in that moment, something shifted that no one was prepared for. Daniel Reyes didn't ask for a priest. He didn't ask for a final meal. He didn't ask to see family. Approved once. And within minutes of that reunion, a trained police dog would signal something that would stop an execution already set in motion. But it wouldn't just delay it. It would expose a truth buried for 10 years. A truth that lived in scent, in silence, in loyalty that refused to fade. Because this wasn't about a goodbye. It was about what the dog remembered. 10 years earlier, Daniel Reyes was not a number in a system. He was Officer Reyes, K-9 Division, mid-sized city in the Midwest. Winters that froze your breath mid-sentence. Summers that baked asphalt into waves of heat. Surgical focus. Ranger had been bred from a European working line. High drive, high intelligence, balanced nerves. The kind of dog departments competed for. But Ranger didn't bond with everyone. He bonded with Daniel. Scent boxes, tracking exercises across muddy fields while frost still clung to grass. Daniel would kneel, press his forehead lightly to Ranger's, and whisper, "Find the truth." It wasn't just a command. It was a ritual. Ranger excelled. Ranger located a lost toddler once, 2 miles from home, following a scent trail through heavy rain. Daniel cried that night in the patrol car, one hand buried in Ranger's fur. "Good boy," he whispered over and over. They were decorated, respected, until the warehouse raid. The tip came through narcotics. Daniel and Ranger were third on entry, body cams on, backup positioned. But something went wrong. The lights inside the warehouse cut out seconds after breach. Shouting, footsteps scattering. And then, gunfire, short, controlled bursts. Daniel returned fire toward a shadow moving behind stacked crates. When lights came back on, 2 suspects were down. An officer was bleeding, and another officer, Sergeant Cole, was holding his shoulder, saying Daniel fired too early. The investigation moved fast. Too fast. Bodycam footage from Daniel's unit was corrupted. Server error, they said. Backup audio incomplete. Sergeant Cole testified that Daniel had advanced beyond his assigned mark, that he had broken formation. Daniel insisted he hadn't. Ranger had been on a scent lock near a side exit. Daniel had followed protocol, but without footage, without proof. The jury saw negligence, then recklessness, then intent. Life without parole became death. Appeals failed. Ranger was reassigned immediately after arrest. No farewell, no closure. Daniel asked once, just once, during trial recess, "Where's my dog?" He hadn't spoken much during final processing, until the chaplain asked, "Is there anything you'd like to request?" Daniel's voice was steady. "Bring my K9. Warden Huxley almost denied it outright. Execution protocol was rigid. Final visits were limited to immediate family, clergy, One appeal note from 5 years prior mentioned prior K9 service. And tucked into the record, almost overlooked, was a commendation letter from the department praising Officer Reyes and K9 Ranger for exemplary service in locating a missing minor under extreme weather conditions. "8 years now. Ranger had adjusted, but Ellison knew something most didn't. Ranger never fully transferred. There were nights the dog would sit near the kennel gate, staring toward the parking lot long after shift ended. Daniel Reyes? Yes. The corridor did not move, but everything inside it shifted. Ranger stood rigid, chest forward, eyes locked on guard Miller. Not barking now, waiting. Daniel remained kneeling inside the cell, chains pooled around his boots. Ellison nodded without looking at him. "No, he doesn't," Miller forced a laugh that didn't land. "He's a dog." "He's a certified scent discrimination K9, Ellison corrected. Ranger stepped closer to Miller, not aggressive, deliberate. Then back to Miller, then to Daniel, connecting something. Ellison crouched beside Ranger. "What is it, boy?" Ranger let out a low, controlled whine. That sound hit Daniel harder than the bark. He knew that tone. "2 hours and 37 minutes remained. Execution prep would begin in 90 minutes. Miller cleared his throat. "This visit is supposed to be 10 minutes. Ellison stood. "Then we'd better use them." He held up the sealed evidence bag. "Where was this stored?" "In intake overflow. For 10 years, yes. Why wasn't it transferred to Central?" Miller hesitated. "It was marked duplicate." Daniel's eyes flickered. "There were no duplicates," he said. Ellison turned slowly. "How do you know?" "Because the casing trajectory report was based on a single recovered fragment." Silence. Ranger sat again, hard, eyes never leaving Miller. The first fracture Miller's hand drifted unconsciously toward his radio. Ellison saw it. "Don't," he said calmly. "I'm not doing anything wrong." "Then let's clarify." Ellison turned to Daniel. "Officer Reyes, did Ranger ever train on scent lineup involving department personnel?" Daniel swallowed. "Yes." "When?" 6 months before the warehouse raid. "For what purpose?" Daniel's jaw tightened. There was suspicion of internal leak. Ranger was used to identify who handled a compromised evidence locker. Miller's face went pale. Ellison caught it. "You were present during that?" Miller didn't answer. Daniel did. He was. Flashback. The locker room 10 years earlier. Ranger in a sterile training room. 5 identical scent jars placed in a line. Each jar handled by a different officer. The one jar carried trace contamination from a compromised evidence bag. Ranger moved down the line, sniffed each, paused at one, sat. The jar tagged Sergeant Cole. The department dismissed it as cross-contamination. Internal Affairs closed the inquiry, but Ranger never forgot. Back in the corridor, Ellison's pulse quickened. Sergeant Cole. The same officer who testified Daniel broke formation. The same officer who was injured in the raid. The same officer whose testimony sealed Daniel's conviction. Ellison turned slowly to Miller. "What was your role in that raid?" "I wasn't on entry." "But?" "I handled intake." "And Sergeant Cole?" Miller's silence was answer enough. Ranger escalates. Without warning, Ranger stood and moved past Miller. He walked directly to the execution chamber doors, sniffed the seam, then turned back. He barked once, short, sharp. Ellison's mind raced. Ranger wasn't linking Miller to Daniel. He was linking Miller to something stored nearby, something that still carried scent memory. "Where are old raid materials stored?" Ellison asked. "Archived," Miller said. "Where?" "Sub-level storage." Ranger began pacing. Back and forth between Miller and the corridor, leading toward administrative access. He was mapping, following invisible lines. Daniel's voice cut through the tension. "Ranger only paces like that when he's building a track." Ellison looked at him. "From what source?" Daniel nodded toward the pouch. "That casing." The request that shouldn't be granted Ellison straightened. "I'm requesting temporary access to sub-level archive." Miller shook his head. "That's not happening." "Why not?" "Because this is an execution wing. Because protocol also says K9 alerts are to be investigated." "This isn't a narcotics corridor." "No," Ellison said quietly. "It's worse." Daniel stepped closer to the bars. "Ask yourself something, Miller." Miller didn't want to, but Daniel continued. If I was reckless that night, why was Ranger on a scent lock near the side exit? Miller said nothing. Daniel's voice hardened. Ranger only locks on exit paths when someone's fleeing. The corridor seemed to shrink. The midpoint twist begins. Miller's radio crackled. Prep team to Wing C in 90 minutes. Ellison made the decision. He unclipped Ranger's leash from his belt and switched to tracking lead. Miller stepped forward. You can't just... I can, Ellison replied calmly. And if I'm wrong, we lose 15 minutes. If I'm right... He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Ranger pulled, not violently, confidently, down the administrative corridor. Miller hesitated, then followed. Because something inside him had already begun to crack. Sub-level storage, the air grew colder, dust thicker, rows of boxed evidence lined steel shelving, each tagged, each sealed. Ranger slowed, nose low. Then, he veered left. 3 aisles in. Stopped at a stack labeled Raid 4719, Daniel Reyes's case number. Ranger's breathing changed, focused. He sniffed one box, ignored it. Second box, ignored it, ignored it. Third box. He froze, then sat. Hard, alert. Ellison's heart pounded. Which one? He whispered. Ranger nudged the third box with his nose. Ellison checked the tag. It listed recovered firearms and ballistic reports. Standard. He opened it. Inside were sealed containers. He lifted the ballistic envelope. Intact. But Ranger wasn't looking at that. He was staring at something tucked beneath. A smaller envelope, unlabeled. Ellison pulled it free. No case number, no barcode, just a handwritten note. Transferred. Per Cole. Miller's breath hitched. Ellison opened it carefully. Inside, another casing fragment, clean, unreported. Daniel's voice echoed in Ellison's memory. There were no duplicates. Ellison checked the trajectory tag attached to the unreported fragment. Different angle, different position, opposite side of the warehouse. This fragment didn't match Daniel's assigned location. It matched Sergeant Cole's. The core reframes Ranger stood and moved to the staircase, then stopped halfway up, turned, looked directly at Miller, not accusing, not aggressive, certain. Ellison's voice was steady. Ranger isn't linking you to Daniel, Miller's shoulders sagged. He's linking me to Cole, Daniel whispered from the top of the stairs. I told them. The hidden history. Miller leaned against the railing. I handled intake that night, he said quietly. Cole came down personally, said there was confusion in the field, told me to mark a fragment as duplicate. Ellison listened carefully. Why would he do that? Because if 2 fragments existed, trajectory could be disputed. Silence. Daniel's voice drifted down. He needed only 1. Ellison closed the envelope. The truth settled heavy in the air. Sergeant Cole had fired the fatal shot. Daniel's round injured, but did not kill, the suspect. Cole's position in the warehouse had placed him in the blind spot. He altered intake, testified against Daniel, secured his own protection. And Ranger had smelled him on the casing 10 years ago, and again today. The stakes multiply. Prep team to Wing C in 60 minutes. Miller looked up. What do we do? Ellison didn't hesitate. We escalate. To who? Internal affairs, state review, anyone who can issue a stay. Daniel's voice carried from above. They won't move that fast. Ellison met his eyes. Then we make them. Ranger let out a sharp bark, not at them, at the clock. The real threat emerges as they climbed back toward Wing C. Miller spoke quietly. Cole's retired. Ellison froze. When? 5 years ago. Where is he now? Miller hesitated. Security consultant. 4? Long pause. The Prison Oversight Board. The air seemed to vanish from the corridor. Daniel's execution wasn't just a sentence, it was an erasure, and the man who framed him sat on the board that would review any last-minute appeal. Music, low drums build. Ranger began pulling again, urgent now, not toward Daniel's cell, toward the administrative office upstairs, where the Oversight Board kept temporary offices during executions, where Sergeant Cole was likely present, waiting, confident. because he believed Daniel Reyes had no witness left. He was wrong. Ranger reached the office door, stopped, sat, and stared. The clock ticked. 54 minutes. And for the first time in 10 years, the truth was not buried. It was standing at the door.